Hello and welcome back. If you've been following this channel for a while, you'll know that I'm fanatical about getting detail out of sharply focused images. And I've just discovered a new technique that will allow us to get even more detail out of a correctly focused and captured image. Now this won't work if the photograph's blurry, out of focus or motion blur, but it will help us to get more detail if you've made a correct capture and you've got lots of information to work with. So let's jump in and have a look. So here's the photograph we're going to use for this example. It was captured with a 100 to 400 zoom lens at 400mm, and it's been cropped down from the original, which was this one. So I cropped it down to just give us the headshot of the bird, and if we zoom in tight we can see that it looks to be pretty sharp. It was taken at 2200 ISO, so there's a little bit of noise there, and if we look at the processing on this, I've applied some adjustments to the basic panel, but the important thing is I've not done any processing in the Lightroom sharpening or denoise. I find that the Topaz denoise and sharpen works a bit better than Lightroom's version, so I left all that until I went into Photoshop to do the final processing. So let's jump across now to Photoshop and have a look and see how I applied the techniques. So here's the image opened in Photoshop, and this version I'm looking at is the one that I processed previously, and I used my existing techniques, and I'll quickly run through those, but this is all about the new technique I've discovered and put into practice. So if I turn on all the adjustments that I've made to the final image, you'll see that there's quite a dramatic difference. But the important thing is if we zoom into, let's go to all the way to 100%, and we're looking at the detail of the bird's eye here, you'll see that there's a bit of noise in the image, and it still looks pretty sharp, but it could be better. So the first thing I do is I make a duplicate copy, and then I apply the Topaz denoise, and then once the denoise has been applied, I apply Topaz Sharpen AI to bring out a little more detail. And you can see there that the noise has been reduced. There's a little bit of an artifact here from the sharpening, but overall it's pretty good. I've applied some other things, like got rid of a bit of a background distraction, put a little bit of lightness and darkness into the image, and one of the other techniques I use is to recover the highlights where there's a little bit of detail. Even though it shows on the histogram that there's no burnt out highlights, these feathers looked a little bit overblown, so I used the technique of recovering the highlights, which is covered in my actions group that I've available on the website. But basically it blends in the over bright highlights and puts a little bit more detail back in. I then use the Nik high structure harsh to try and extract some mid-tone contrast out of the image, and that's blended to luminosity, and it reduced opacity about 50%. And you can see that that also brings out a little bit more of the texture. I then typically would use some tonal contrast from Nik to boost up the color, and another technique I use, which is the inverse overlay, to remap the tones in the image, which again is covered in another video, and then a little bit of selective sharpening and curves, and there's the final image. Now if we zoom into 100%, it looks pretty good. There's maybe a little bit of graininess in there, maybe not quite perfect. If we go back to the original image, you'll see that that's what it was, and this is how we've processed it. And you can see that all of this fine detail in the eye and the beak and the feathers here has been brought out really well. But the new technique I've got just enhances this a little bit more. So we'll jump over to the other version and have a look at that now. Okay, so let's have a look at this new technique, and here's another version of the same file that I opened up, and I've carried out all the same adjustments, and we'll step through how we get this extra sharpening information out of there. Okay, so base image, what we do is I make a duplicate of the base image and apply Topaz denoise with no sharpening. You can see there that it's reduced the noise out of the photograph, and then separately on another layer, although you could use it on the same layer once you've done the denoise, is I've applied a bit of Topaz Sharpen AI, and I've used the out of focus very blurry option, even though the focus was good and it was pretty sharp. That one appeared to me to give us the best result. So far we're exactly the same as the technique I've used before. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky, so hopefully you'll be able to follow along. So with this layer that I've already applied the Topaz Sharpening to, I'm going to make 2 copies of this layer. So I just drag that down to the plus symbol at the bottom of the layers palette, make 2 copies of that, and so I've now got 2 extra copies. Now I'll take the top copy, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to invert the image. So the shortcut for that is Control I, gives you a negative version of the image, and then what we're going to do is we're going to blend that to vivid light. And at this stage it should look pretty much grey. There are a few details popping out, but basically I've now got a photograph that is in a negative, and we've got a vivid light blend, so it's basically similar to the high pass filter, but this one works a little better. So now that we've got this inverted layer, we go up to the filter, blur, and go to Gaussian blur. And I've previously done this, and I've used a value somewhere between 3 and 4. For the example I'm going to use on this so that it's pretty clear, I'm going to use a value of 4, so a radius of 4 pixels, and you can all of a sudden see now all the detail is coming out. So that looks fine, but how do we apply this as a sharpening layer, because at the moment it looks pretty horrible. So what we do now is we take this layer that we've applied, we've inverted and applied the blur filter to, shift and click on the next layer below, which was just a copy of the previous layer, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a group from those layers. So just click on make group from layers, and I'll just call this VL Sharp for vivid light, and click OK. Still looks terrible, but here's the tricky bit. With that now applied to a group, we, instead of the pass-through blend mode, we blend it to, yes, you've guessed it, overlay. And you'll see now that instantly we've now got a great deal more sharpening applied to the image. Now once we've done that, we can do a couple of things. We can reduce the opacity if it's too strong by just using the opacity slider, and you can see that by reducing it down to nothing, you've got no sharpening applied, and taking it all away, I'll leave it at 100% at this point. Now one of the things that does happen when you apply a lot of sharpening is that you tend to get those halos around the edges. So in a previous video I demonstrated how to solve a lot of that, and so if we double click with our left mouse button on the right hand side of the layer, we open up the layer styles panel. What we're going to do is we're going to reduce the blending in the darker tones by moving this slider across, and then we hold down the Alt key and split that slider to feather the effect, and we do the same thing on the highlights. And I've worked it on about 230 down to about 200. It's a little bit variable, but that reduces the effect of the highlights and the halos around the edges. You can see now that that's made a dramatic difference to the sharpening of the image. You can see a lot more detail, and if I turn that off and turn those layers off, there's our base image before we did anything. I did the denoise, I did the sharpening, and now I've done this vivid light blend extra sharpening, and you'll see that it really does increase the amount of sharpening. Now if this is too much, obviously you can reduce the opacity. Even though I've changed the blending a little bit, you could still reduce the opacity, and of course you could also apply a mask to that group to reduce the effectiveness of where it's applied. And if I go back through now and just apply all of the other same adjustments that I did on the previous image, we can now see the overall difference. So this is my new version, and this is my previous version. Now I thought the previous version was pretty good. At 100% you're seeing a few little grainy artifacts, but to be honest, when you print this or even resize it for use on the web, you're not going to see any of this information. But the even sharper version looks absolutely stunning. So let's just go back to fit the screen with that and do the same with that one, and we can see the difference between the two. This one just looks that much sharper. It's a little bit clearer. Even though this one I was pretty happy with before, applying that new version of sharpening, it just makes an incredible difference, and we can zoom into 100% and we can make out all of those individual membranes on the feathers. We could still do that on the previous one, but this one's just got a little bit more. And again, as I said, we can always adjust that opacity if we find it's a little bit too much for us. So that, I think, is a worthwhile technique, another tool in the arsenal of producing images that have got a lot of detail in them. So I hope that's been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for watching.